You're lying in a hospital bed. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Machines beep in rhythm with your heartbeat. A nurse draws your blood, and in that crimson vial, something ancient stirs. Something that doesn't belong to you alone. 40,000 years ago, a Neanderthal named Crag crouched beside a dying fire in an ice-carved cave. The wind howled. His daughter shivered with fever. He had no medicine, no doctor, no understanding of the invisible war raging inside her body, but her immune system understood. It had been learning for 400,000 years. That same immune system lives in you right now. The genes that saved Crag's daughter are fighting for your survival at this exact moment. 1 to 4% of your DNA isn't purely human. It's Neanderthal, battle-tested, Ice Age hardened, savage, and it's keeping you alive. In 2010, a team of scientists in Leipzig, Germany, accomplished something impossible. They took a fragment of bone, 40,000 years old, and read the complete genetic code of a species that had been extinct since your ancestors were painting caves. Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute had sequenced the Neanderthal genome. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about who we are. The discovery was startling. Every person of European or Asian descent carries Neanderthal DNA, not metaphorically, literally. 1 to 4% of your genetic code came from them. If you're of African descent, you carry almost none, which tells us exactly when and where this mixing happened. 50 to 60,000 years ago, when modern humans migrated out of Africa, they met Neanderthals in the Middle East and Europe. And they didn't just meet, they bred. This wasn't a one-time accident. The interbreeding continued for thousands of years. Multiple encounters, multiple generations. Children born of both species, carrying genes from 2 different kinds of human. Those hybrid children survived. They thrived. And their Neanderthal genes spread through the growing Homo sapiens population like ripples across water. But here's what makes this extraordinary. Evolution didn't keep random Neanderthal genes. Natural selection is ruthless. It preserves what works and discards what doesn't. The Neanderthal DNA that survived in your genome survived because it helped your ancestors live. These weren't genetic accidents. They were advantages. More than 100 specific Neanderthal gene variants have been identified affecting modern human biology. They're not scattered randomly. They cluster around specific systems: immune function, skin and hair traits, blood clotting, metabolism, pain perception. These are the genes that mattered. The genes that meant survival versus death in the unforgiving world your ancestors faced. Let's go back to that cave. 40,000 years ago, Crag stood at the cave entrance, watching smoke rise from the valley below. Different smoke than his clan made. The fires burned hotter, fed by wood arranged in patterns his people didn't use. The strangers had arrived 3 days ago. Homo sapiens. Anatomically modern humans, taller than Crag's people, less robust. Their faces were flatter, their brow ridges smaller. They carried spears with different points, made with a technique Crag had never seen. He'd watched them from the ridgeline, counted 20 individuals. Mostly young, they moved with confidence, these newcomers, like they owned the valley that Crag's clan had hunted for 3 generations. Their voices carried on the wind, a rapid-fire babble that sounded almost like speech, but with rhythms Crag didn't recognize. His eldest daughter, 13 years old, watched beside him. Strong girl. Good with the scraper, patient with hide working. She'd noticed the strangers too, noticed the young males among them. Crag had seen her watching with more than curiosity. The landscape was changing. Not just the strangers, but everything. The great ice sheets that had defined his father's world were retreating. The mammoth herds had thinned. These Homo sapiens, they seemed to follow the changing climate like they were born to it. Maybe they were. They came from warmer lands, everyone said. From the south where ice never touched the ground, Crag didn't hate them. Hate required energy his people couldn't spare, but he recognized competition when he saw it. The valley could only feed so many hunters. The reindeer migration routes could only sustain so many clans. Something would have to give, What Crag couldn't know, standing there in the cold dawn, was that his daughter's children would be part of both worlds. That the merging had already begun. That in the cave systems to the east, Neanderthal women were already carrying hybrid babies. That the future didn't belong to pure Neanderthals or pure Homo sapiens, but to the mix. The genes that Crag carried, forged by 400,000 years of Ice Age survival, would be tested against the genes these newcomers brought from Africa. And evolution would choose, not based on prejudice or pride, but on cold mathematical reality. Which genes helped humans survive? Which genes could fight the diseases of this new mixed world? Which genes could adapt to the rapid climate shifts ahead? The answer would be written in your DNA. Crag turned from the valley and walked back to his fire. His daughter followed. She glanced back once at the distant smoke before the cave darkness swallowed them both. In 10 years, she would mate with a Homo sapiens male. Her children would carry Crag's immune genes, his pain tolerance genes, his cold-adapted skin genes. Those genes would spread through the hybrid population. It's carried by thousands, then millions, then billions of descendants. Natural selection kept the Neanderthal genes that worked. The genes that protected against European diseases. The genes that helped bodies survive northern winters. The genes that let blood clot faster after hunting injuries. The genes that mattered, but which genes exactly? And why did evolution choose them? The answer lies in the deadliest challenge your ancestors faced, and one you face every winter. Word count. 840 words. Winter came hard that year. Not the gentle cold that Crag's people could manage, but the killing cold that found weakness in even the strongest bodies. It started with the children. Crag's youngest daughter, just 6 years old, woke with a cough that rattled in her chest like stones in a leather bag. By evening, her forehead burned with fever. Then 2 more children fell ill. Then Nira, Crag's mate, felt a sickness settling into her lungs. The cave filled with the sounds of labored breathing, of bodies fighting an invisible enemy. Crag kept the fire burning high, though it consumed their carefully hoarded wood. He brought water from the half-frozen stream. He chewed meat until it was soft enough for fevered mouths. And he waited. He didn't understand disease the way you do. Couldn't see the bacteria multiplying in inflamed tissue. Couldn't know about immune cells mobilizing in response to infection. But he'd seen this before. A respiratory illness that swept through the clan. Some survived. Some didn't. The pattern was always the same. The young and the old were most vulnerable. The strong endured. His daughter fought the fever for 3 days. Her small body burned. Her breathing came shallow and quick. Crag sat beside her through the second night, watching her chest rise and fall, willing her to keep breathing. Nira, sick herself, kept the child warm against her own fevered body. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. The girl's eyes opened clear. She was weak, hollow-cheeked, but alive. Her Neanderthal immune system had won. What Crag couldn't know was why. Why his daughter survived when other children in other clans didn't. The answer was written in her genes, in immune system variants that had been evolving for 400,000 years. Variants that you might carry right now. When modern humans migrated out of Africa 50,000 years ago, they carried immune systems optimized for African diseases, parasites, tropical infections. The specific bacteria and viruses that had shaped human evolution in warm climates for hundreds of thousands of years. But Europe wasn't Africa. The diseases were different. The pathogens had evolved in cold climates, had adapted to Eurasian animals, had become specialists at surviving in Ice Age conditions. Neanderthals had been living in Europe for 400 millennia. Their immune systems had been learning the entire time. Every epidemic that swept through their populations was a brutal education. The individuals with immune genes that could recognize and fight European pathogens survived. Those without them died, generation after generation. Natural selection refined the Neanderthal immune system into something exquisitely adapted to European diseases. When Homo sapiens arrived with their African-optimized immune systems, they were vulnerable. But some of them bred with Neanderthals, and their children inherited something precious, immune genes that already knew how to fight. 3 gene clusters made all the difference. The HLA genes, human leukocyte antigens, which teach your immune system to recognize foreign invaders. The TLR genes, toll-like receptors, which detect bacterial infections and trigger inflammation. And the OAS genes, which fight viral infections. All 3 gene families show Neanderthal variants in modern human populations. And all 3 are still protecting you. Research from Stanford University Medical School found that specific variants from Neanderthals appear in 50% of modern Europeans. These variants are exceptionally good at recognizing certain viral proteins. When a virus enters your body, these Neanderthal genes help your immune system identify the threat faster, mount a response quicker. The difference between recovering in days versus weeks, or between recovering and not recovering at all, the TLR genes tell an even more interesting story. Neanderthal variants increase inflammation response to bacterial infections. More inflammation means more immune cells flooding to the infection site, more aggressive attack on the bacteria. In Craig's world, where a wound could become infected with deadly bacteria from soil or animal bites, this aggressive response saved lives. In your world, that same aggressive response can cause problems. Autoimmune disorders, excessive inflammation, allergies. The genes that save Neanderthals sometimes hurt modern humans living in cleaner, safer environments. The most dramatic evidence came during the COVID pandemic. Researchers with the COVID-19 Host Genetics Initiative made a startling discovery. A cluster of Neanderthal genes on chromosome 3 increased severe COVID risk by 60%. People who inherited this variant were far more likely to need hospitalization, to require ventilators to die. But a different Neanderthal gene variant on chromosome 12 did the opposite. It reduced severe COVID risk by 22%. Same species, different genes, opposite effects. The lesson is clear. Neanderthal immune genes are powerful, but they're not uniformly good or bad. They're adapted to specific threats. In Craig's daughter, fighting a bacterial respiratory infection in an Ice Age cave, those genes were life-saving. In a modern human, fighting a novel coronavirus, the same genetic heritage could be protective, or deadly, depending on which specific variants you inherited. But here's what matters. Without any Neanderthal immune genes, early Homo sapiens might not have survived European colonization at all. The diseases would have killed them before they could adapt. The Neanderthal genes bought them time, bought them survival, bought them the chance to become your ancestors. Craig's daughter recovered fully. Within a week, she was playing again, her laughter echoing in the cave. The clan had survived another crisis, but Neanderthal genes didn't just help you fight disease. They changed how your body experiences the world itself, starting with the very flesh you're wrapped in. The blizzard came from the north, howling across the tundra like a living thing. Craig had been tracking the elk herd for 2 days, and now he stood waist-deep in fresh snow, face exposed to wind that cut like flint blades. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. Ice crystals formed in his thick beard. His fingertips had gone numb an hour ago, but he didn't turn back. The elk were close. He could smell them on the wind, the distinctive musk of large herbivores in winter. Could see their tracks disappearing into the white wall of falling snow ahead. His clan needed this kill. Needed the meat, the hide, the fat that would keep them alive through the darkest months. So Craig pushed forward, his stocky body built like a furnace, conserving heat in a way the taller, lankier Homo sapiens simply couldn't match. His skin had been shaped by this cold. Not just toughened by exposure, though years of harsh weather had weathered his face into deep lines and rough texture, but shaped at the genetic level, built by evolution to survive conditions that would kill an unprotected human in hours. You can see Neanderthal skin genes in a mirror today. If you have pale skin, you're looking at their legacy. If you have red or auburn hair, you might be seeing their genes expressed in every strand. The very texture of your skin, the thickness of your hair, the way your body responds to cold or sun. All of it potentially influenced by DNA that evolved in Ice Age Europe. The BNC2 gene is one of the most significant. This gene affects skin pigmentation, determining how much melanin your skin produces. Neanderthal variants of BNC2 are found in 70% of modern Europeans. These variants shift pigmentation toward lighter tones, which seems counterintuitive until you understand the environment. In Africa, dark skin protects against intense ultraviolet radiation. Melanin acts like a natural sunscreen. But in Ice Age Europe, at latitudes where winter sun barely rose above the horizon, dark skin became a liability. Your body needs sunlight to produce vitamin D, essential for bone health, immune function, calcium absorption. Dark skin blocks the UV light needed for vitamin D synthesis. In the weak northern sun, that could mean the difference between healthy children and children with rickets. Weakened bones, stunted growth, lighter skin, let more UV light through. Let northern bodies synthesize enough vitamin D to survive. Natural selection favored the lighter variants. And those variants came from Neanderthals who had been adapting to northern light conditions for hundreds of thousands of years. The MC1R gene tells an even more visible story. This gene affects both skin pigmentation and hair color. Multiple Neanderthal variants of MC1 have been identified, and some of them produce red hair and very pale skin. Not all red hair comes from Neanderthals, but genetic analysis shows that some red-haired individuals inherited their coloring from ancient cousins who walked Europe 40,000 years ago. Craig's hair was dark, but he'd seen red-haired children born in neighboring clans, seen the pale skin that went with it, skin that burned easily in summer sun, but somehow survived the winter. Different genetic lottery. Same Ice Age adaptation, but pigmentation was only the surface. Literally, the real adaptations went deeper. Keratin genes determine hair thickness and texture. Neanderthal variants produce thicker, coarser hair. Hair that provides better insulation, that traps body heat more efficiently. Hair that doesn't freeze as easily when wet. Small advantage, but in a world where exposure could kill, small advantages accumulated into survival. The POU2F3 gene affects skin thickness itself. Neanderthal variants create thicker skin, more resistant to cold damage, less sensitive to temperature extremes. Researchers at University College London found that populations from cold climates show higher frequencies of this Neanderthal variant. Your skin may literally be thicker because of genes from people who endured Ice Age winters. Even body fat distribution shows Neanderthal influence. Genes affecting subcutaneous fat, the insulating layer beneath your skin, show variants that alter where and how fat is stored. Neanderthal bodies were stockier with shorter limbs and broader torsos. This wasn't just skeletal structure. It was thermal engineering. Less surface area relative to body mass meant less heat loss. More core body fat meant better insulation. Craig's body demonstrated the principle perfectly. At 5'5" and heavily muscled, built like a barrel, he retained heat far better than the tall, lean Homo sapiens hunters he'd observed. When both groups traveled in winter, the newcomers had to stop more frequently to warm themselves, had to wear more hides, had to stay closer to fire. Craig could hunt in conditions that would have sent them shivering back to shelter. Research published in 2023 added another layer. Neanderthal genes affect modern human response to sun exposure and vitamin D synthesis beyond just skin pigmentation. Some variants change how efficiently your body converts sunlight into vitamin D. Others affect vitamin D receptor function, altering how your cells respond to the vitamin once it's produced. These weren't cosmetic changes. They were survival mechanisms. Adaptations forged by the harshest climate modern humans had ever encountered. Your skin is Arctic armor, designed by evolution, inherited from people who lived and died in the ice. Craig finally spotted the elk through the blowing snow. A young bull, separated from the herd, struggling through a drift. He raised his spear, muscles tightening despite the cold. His thick skin barely felt the wind anymore. The hunt was on. But skin deep doesn't scratch the surface of what Neanderthals gave you. The changes went deeper, into your blood itself, into every heartbeat, into whether you'd survive bleeding out on an ancient battlefield or a modern operating table. The mammoth hunt had gone wrong. Craig had seen it happening in slow motion, the way terrible things always seem to unfold when you're powerless to stop them. The young bull mammoth, cornered against a rocky outcrop, had panicked. Its massive tusks swept sideways faster than anything that large should move. One tusk caught Crag's thigh. It's not a direct hit, but a glancing blow that opened his flesh like wet leather. He felt the impact before the pain, felt the hot rush of blood soaking through his hide leggings. Then the pain arrived, white hot and immediate, shooting from his leg up through his entire body. He stumbled backward, other hunters rushing in to distract the mammoth, to give him space to fall. The blood came fast, too fast. Crag pressed both hands against the wound, feeling the pulsing warmth between his fingers. This was how hunters died, not from the initial injury, but from the bleeding after. He'd seen strong men reduced to pale corpses because their blood wouldn't stop flowing. But Crag's blood was different. Within seconds, the flow began to slow, not stopping, but slowing. His body was already mobilizing an ancient defense system, a cascade of proteins and cellular responses that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of dangerous living. Platelets rushed to the wound site, sticky cells that clumped together to form a temporary plug. Clotting factors activated in sequence, each enzyme triggering the next, building a fibrin mesh that would seal the tear in his flesh. His clanmates dragged him away from the mammoth, away from the danger. Nira appeared, her face tight with worry but her hands steady. She'd done this before. They all had. She packed the wound with clean snow, the cold helping constrict blood vessels. Then she bound it tightly with leather strips, adding pressure to help the clotting process. Crag gritted his teeth against the pain and watched his own blood darken on the snow. But it was slowing. Definitely slowing. By the time Nira finished binding the wound, the bleeding had reduced to a seep. His body was winning the race. What Crag couldn't know was that his survival depended on a specific gene variant. The F5 gene, which produces a protein called factor V, a crucial component of the blood clotting cascade. The Neanderthal version of this gene, what modern medicine calls factor V Leiden mutation, makes blood clot faster than the standard human variant. For an Ice Age hunter, this was life-saving. Mammoth tusks, cave bear claws, auric horns, the megafauna of Pleistocene Europe were massive and dangerous. Hunting them meant constant risk of serious injury. Faster clotting meant the difference between bleeding to death in the snow and making it back to camp alive. Genetic research has confirmed that this clotting variant exists in modern human populations because of Neanderthal ancestry. About 5% of Europeans carry factor V Leiden today. It's almost completely absent in African and East Asian populations that lack significant Neanderthal DNA. The distribution pattern tells the evolutionary story clearly, but here's where the ancient advantage becomes a modern problem. The same gene that saved Crag's life makes modern carriers more susceptible to blood clots in the wrong places. Deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolisms, stroke. In a sedentary modern lifestyle where humans sit for hours without moving, blood that clots too easily becomes dangerous. The genes that evolve for constant physical activity and frequent traumatic injuries are maladapted to office chairs and airline seats. It's not just factor V. Multiple clotting-related genes show Neanderthal variants in modern populations. F12, F2, PRO, C each affects different steps in the coagulation cascade. Research published in 2022 found that Neanderthal variants affect platelet count and function. People carrying these genes have 10 to 15% more platelets on average, those tiny cell fragments that form the first line of defense against bleeding. More platelets meant better survival odds for Neanderthal hunters, meant wounds sealed faster, meant more men made it home. Natural selection favored these variants intensely because hunting was so dangerous and injuries were so common. The evolutionary pressure was enormous and constant. Modern medicine now screens for these variants before major surgery or when prescribing birth control pills, which further increase clotting risk. What your doctor might call a genetic predisposition to thrombosis is actually an Ice Age hunting adaptation that's outlived its usefulness. Crag survived the mammoth wound. The gash healed over 3 weeks, leaving a thick scar that pulled when he walked. He'd carry a slight limp for months, but he lived. Lived to hunt again. Lived to pass his fast clotting genes to his daughters. Lived to become one more link in the genetic chain connecting Ice Age Europe to your own bloodstream. Back in the cave, as Neera stitched the wound closed with sinew thread, Crag felt grateful for his body's response, even if he couldn't understand the mechanisms. He'd seen other hunters die from similar wounds. He'd pressed his hands against their injuries and felt their blood flowing without stopping, felt their pulse weakening, watched the light fade from their eyes. His blood had saved him, the same. Blood that pumps through your veins right now, carrying oxygen and nutrients, carrying immune cells and hormones, carrying genetic memories of survival that your body still knows how to use. But Crag's blood did more than clot his wounds. It carried oxygen in ways that would help his descendants survive in places he'd never imagined. High places. Thinner places where every breath was a struggle and only the genetically fortunate could thrive. Summer meant migration. Every year, as the lowland valleys grew warm and the prey herds moved upward following fresh grass, Crag's clan followed. They climbed into the mountains, where snow still clung to north-facing slopes and the air grew thin enough to notice Crag. Had made this journey every summer of his life. He knew the trail, knew the landmarks, knew which passes were safe and which held hidden dangers. But this year was different. This year, Neera was heavily pregnant with their second daughter, and the climb was taking its toll. He watched her struggle up the steep section. One hand braced against the rock face, the other cradling her swollen belly. Her breathing came hard and fast, labored in the thinning air. Each step seemed to require a decision, an act of will. Sweat darkened her leather tunic despite the cold wind.
After Crag told her,
and she nodded gratefully, sinking onto a flat boulder. Around them, the clan spread out along the mountain trail. Some moved easily, breathing steady despite the altitude. Others struggled like Neera, their faces flushed, their chests heaving. His eldest daughter, now 14, bounded up the slope like a mountain goat, barely winded. She'd inherited something from Crag that not everyone possessed. The ability to breathe thin air. At 8,000 feet elevation, the air holds about 25% less oxygen than at sea level. Your lungs pull in the same volume of breath, but each lungful delivers less fuel to your blood. Your heart has to work harder. Your breathing rate increases. Some people adapt quickly. Others struggle for days. And some never fully adjust. The difference comes down to genes. Specifically genes that control how your body responds to low oxygen conditions. How efficiently your blood carries what oxygen is available. How quickly your cells can function with less fuel than they expect. Crag had those genes. So did his daughter. Neera didn't. Or at least, not the same variants. The genetic lottery had given her different strengths, but altitude tolerance wasn't one of them. The EPA's one gene is key to altitude adaptation. It regulates your body's response to hypoxia, the medical term for insufficient oxygen. When oxygen levels drop, EPA's 1 helps determine whether your body produces more hemoglobin to carry what oxygen is available, or finds other ways to adapt. Some Neanderthal variants of this gene create different responses than the standard. Human version, more hemoglobin, sounds like it should always be better. More oxygen carrying capacity, right? But it's not that simple. Too much hemoglobin makes blood thick and sluggish. It can actually reduce oxygen delivery to tissues because the thick blood flows poorly through small capillaries. It increases stroke risk. The balance matters. Modern. Genetic research has found that some populations with long histories of high-altitude living carry unique gene variants. Tibetans, for instance, have Denisovan genes. Denisovans were cousins to Neanderthals who lived in Asia. These genes help them maintain lower hemoglobin levels at altitude while still delivering oxygen efficiently. It's a different solution to the same problem. Neanderthals weren't high-altitude specialists the way Tibetans became, but they lived in mountainous Ice Age Europe, following herds into high valleys each summer, adapting to seasonal altitude changes. Their genes reflect that lifestyle. Research from 2018 found multiple Neanderthal variants affecting lung capacity. oxygen utilization, efficiency, and hemoglobin regulation. Some modern humans inherited those variants. If you're someone who adjusts quickly to altitude, who can hike at 10,000 feet without gasping? Who doesn't get splitting headaches in mountain towns? You might be experiencing Neanderthal genes at work, but like most genetic traits, there are trade-offs. Some of the same Neanderthal respiratory variants that help at altitude increase asthma risk at sea level. Evolution doesn't create perfect solutions. It creates solutions optimized for specific environments. When the environment changes, yesterday's advantage can become today's liability. Crag led his clan higher. They'd camp at the summer site his father had used and his grandfather before him. A cave system with good views of the valley below, near water, protected from weather. The altitude kept away some of the biting insects that plagued the lowlands. The cooler temperatures preserved meat longer. The prey animals grew fat on mountain grass. His daughter reached the summit first, standing on the ridge with wind whipping her hair. Looking down at the path, the rest still climbed. She wasn't breathing hard. Her body had shifted seamlessly to the thinner air, her cells efficiently extracting what oxygen was available. Her metabolism adjusted without conscious thought. This was genetic inheritance in action. The same way she had Crag's thick hair and stocky build, she had his altitude-adapted respiratory system, genes passing from parent to child, carrying 400,000 years of evolutionary refinement. Nira finally reached the summit an hour later. Exhausted but determined, Crag helped her to the cave, settled her near the fire they'd started. She'd recover. Her body would adapt over the next few days, producing more red blood cells, adjusting her breathing patterns. But it would never be as easy for her as it was for Crag. Evolution had given different tools to different people. Some breathed easily in thin air. Some fought disease better. Some tolerated cold or processed food more efficiently. The mixing of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens genes was creating new combinations, new possibilities. But breathing wasn't the only invisible battle Neanderthal genes prepared you for. Deep in your cells, ancient metabolic switches were being flipped, determining how your body transforms food into fuel, and whether you'd survive the feast or famine cycle that defined Ice Age existence. 6 days without a successful hunt. 6 days of watching the clan's food stores dwindle to nothing. 6 days of hunger gnawing at Crag's belly like a living thing that wouldn't sleep. Winter had arrived early and fierce. The reindeer migration had passed weeks ago, the herds taking routes farther south than usual, avoiding the worst of the storms. The clan had managed to bring down one old bull, but 20 people consumed a reindeer faster than you'd think. The meat was gone. The marrow had been cracked from every bone. Even the hide had been boiled to extract the last traces of fat and protein. Now they had nothing. Crag portioned out the last of the dried meat, giving the largest shares to Nira and the children. His own portion fit in his palm. He chewed it slowly, making it last, knowing it would be his only food today. Maybe tomorrow too. His body had already shifted into a different mode, a metabolic state his genes had been preparing for since birth. Starvation mode. You've probably heard the term. Maybe you've even felt it, if you've ever skipped meals or tried an extreme diet. That sluggish feeling, the way your body seems to cling to every calorie, the way weight loss becomes maddeningly difficult after the first few days. Your body fighting against the deficit, convinced it's in danger. That response is ancient, and parts of it came from Neanderthals. Crag's body was doing something extraordinary. With no food coming in, it was switching fuel sources. Normally, your cells run on glucose, blood sugar derived from carbohydrates, but without food, glucose runs out fast. So the body pivots. It begins breaking down stored fat, converting it into ketones that can fuel the brain and muscles. It slows the metabolism, reducing energy expenditure. It becomes ruthlessly efficient. Some bodies do this better than others. Some people can fast for days with relatively minor discomfort. Others feel terrible after missing a single meal. The difference is partly genetic, and some of those genes came from people who lived and died by their ability to survive without food. The SLC16A11 and SLC16A13 genes are key players. These genes affect how your body processes glucose and stores fat. Neanderthal variants of these genes appear in 50% of Latino populations and 10 to 15% of Europeans. Research has shown that people carrying these variants are more efficient at storing fat. When food is abundant and maintaining blood sugar levels, when food is scarce in Craig's world, this was pure survival advantage. Ice Age Europe ran on a boom and bust cycle. Summer and fall brought abundance. Berries, roots, fish runs, migrating herds. A successful mammoth hunt provided thousands of pounds of meat and fat. The clan would feast, their bodies storing the excess as subcutaneous fat, building reserves for the lean times everyone knew were coming. Then winter arrived. The plants died. The fish disappeared under ice. The herds scattered or migrated beyond reach, and the clan survived on stored fat in whatever small game they could trap or scavenge. The people who stored fat most efficiently, who could maintain their energy and mental function on minimal calories, they were the ones who survived to spring. The ones who passed their genes forward. These are sometimes called thrifty genes. Genes that helped our ancestors survive famine. But here's the devastating irony. In the modern world where food is constantly available, where you're never more than a few minutes from a calorie source, these same genes become liabilities. The Neanderthal variants that helped Craig survive. 6 days without food now increase type 2 diabetes risk by 20 to 30% in modern populations. The efficient fat storage becomes obesity. The tendency to maintain blood sugar becomes insulin resistance. The metabolic adaptations that saved lives in the Ice Age are killing people in the 21st century. Other metabolic genes tell similar stories. TCF7L2, PPARG, FTO multiple Neanderthal variants affect insulin sensitivity and fat distribution patterns. Research published in 2019 found that some Neanderthal variants even affect gut microbiome composition, changing how efficiently your intestines extract calories from food. More efficient extraction meant survival during famine. It also means modern carriers extract more calories from the same meals as people without these variants. Lipid metabolism genes show Neanderthal influence too. Variants affecting cholesterol levels, triglyceride processing, how your body stores different types of fat. All of it optimized for a world of scarcity that no longer exists for most humans. On the 7th day, the hunters finally brought down a reindeer. A young doe, not as large as they'd hoped, but meat nonetheless. The clan fell on it with desperate hunger. Craig forced himself to eat slowly, knowing gorging after days of fasting could make him sick. But his body absorbed every molecule of nutrition, storing what it could, replenishing depleted reserves. He watched his daughters eat, their hollow cheeks filling with color as the food revived them. Strong girls, survivors, they'd inherited his thrifty genes, his efficient metabolism. In this world, those genes kept them alive. In the world their distant descendants would inhabit, those same genes might sentence them to a different kind of struggle. Nira ate her share silently, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. The baby inside was growing despite the famine, pulling nutrients from her body's reserves, demonstrating the ruthless efficiency of Neanderthal metabolism. Life finding a way. Even in the hardest times, Craig's body flooded with satisfaction as his blood sugar normalized, as his ketone levels dropped, as his cells switched back to glucose metabolism. The crisis had passed. His genes had carried him through another test, but the hunger that shaped those genes did something else. Something you feel every time you stub your toe or burn your hand. Neanderthal DNA changed how your nerves scream warnings to your brain. Changed whether you're the person who barely feels a paper cut or the one who feels everything. Craig had been living with the toothache for 5 days. The molar on his left side had cracked 3 weeks ago, probably from chewing hide to soften it for clothing. A small crack at first, barely noticeable, but infection had found its way in, and now the entire side of his face was swollen. It's the pain, a constant throbbing presence that radiated from his jaw into his temple. He could taste the infection, metallic and rotten. His tongue kept finding the broken tooth, probing the sharp edges. The exposed nerve that sent lightning bolts of agony through his skull every time he touched it. The left side of his face felt hot to the touch. Puffy and tender, but Crag kept working. He sat outside the cave in weak winter sunlight, hands moving with practiced precision as he shaped a new spear point from flint. The work required total concentration. One wrong strike, and the stone would shatter uselessly. The pain in his tooth was immense, a screaming distraction. But his hands remained steady. Strike, examine, rotate the stone. Strike again. The rhythm of tool-making. It's unchanged despite the agony. Other clan members had watched him with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. When Nira's brother had suffered a similar infection 2 years ago, he'd been unable to do anything but huddle by the fire, whimpering. But Crag worked through it. Not because he wanted to. Because survival demanded it. The clan needed spear points. Winter didn't care about your pain. What Crag couldn't know was that his ability to function through severe pain was partly genetic. Written into the structure of his nerve cells, into the ion channels that determine how pain signals travel from injury site to brain. Some people's nerves scream louder than others. Some people's brains interpret those signals as unbearable. And some people, like Crag, can acknowledge the pain and work through it anyway. The SCN9A gene is central to this difference. It codes for sodium channels in pain-sensing neurons, the specialized nerve cells that detect tissue damage and transmit warning signals. Neanderthal variants of this gene exist in about 30% of modern Europeans. These variants change how isolated sodium flows through the channels, which changes how readily the neurons fire, which changes how much pain you feel. But here's where it gets strange. The Neanderthal variants don't simply make you feel more or less pain. They're selective. Research from University College London in 2020 found that specific. Neanderthal ion channel variants make carriers 7% more likely to experience chronic pain conditions. But other studies showed that different Neanderthal pain genes reduce the sensitivity to cold pain and pressure pain. It's a paradox. The same genetic heritage that makes some people more vulnerable to chronic pain also made Neanderthals more resistant to the specific types of pain their environment inflicted most frequently. Cold exposure pain, the deep ache of frozen fingers and toes, the pressure pain of carrying heavy loads over long distances. These were constant features of Ice Age life, and evolution built tolerance into the system. But inflammatory pain, the kind that signals infection or deep tissue damage, that pain remained sharp and attention-grabbing. Because that pain carried important information. That pain said your body was fighting a battle it might lose. That pain demanded response. Even if you could continue functioning through it. Crag's tooth pain was inflammatory pain, the worst kind. But his genes let him partition it somehow. Acknowledge it without being overwhelmed by it. His hands kept working, even as his jaw throbbed. His mind stayed focused on the spear point, even as infection pulsed through his face. On the 6th day, the infection finally broke. He felt it happen, felt the abscess burst and drain, flooding his mouth with foul-tasting pus. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. The pressure vanished. The throbbing reduced to a dull ache. He spat the infection into the snow and felt his body begin to heal. Other genes affect pain perception too. The FAAH gene influences your endocannabinoid system, the network of receptors and molecules that your body uses to naturally reduce pain. Some Neanderthal variants change how efficiently this system works. People with certain variants produce higher levels of natural pain-reducing compounds, essentially running with a built-in painkiller system that others lack. There's also the question of what pain meant in terms of survival. In modern medicine, we try to eliminate pain quickly. But in Crag's world, pain served as essential information. It told you which leg to favor, which hand to rest, where infection was taking hold. The people who felt no pain at all rarely survived long. They'd re-injure themselves without knowing it, walk on broken bones, ignore infections until it was too late. But people who were incapacitated by normal levels of pain didn't survive either. Couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, couldn't contribute. Natural selection favored a middle path. Feel the pain, understand the warning, but don't let it stop you from doing what survival requires. Crag finished the spear point. Running his thumb along the edge to test its sharpness, perfect. His jaw still ached, but it was healing. He'd worked through worse pain before. He'd work through worse again. That was what survival meant. But pain wasn't the only sensation Neanderthal genes reshaped. Every smell that triggers a memory, every taste that repulses you. Every morning you wake without needing an alarm, all of it traces back to sensory systems battle-tested in a world you can barely imagine. Crag woke in darkness. Complete darkness. The kind of darkness that exists only deep in caves, where no moonlight penetrates, where the fire has burned down to dull embers that give no useful light. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face, couldn't see the cave walls, couldn't see Nira sleeping beside him or his daughters curled together for warmth, but his body knew it was time to wake. No external signal had roused him. No sound, no light, no change in temperature. Just an internal alarm, precise and insistent, telling him that dawn was approaching outside, that the hunting day was beginning, that his body needed to prepare for activity even though the world around him gave no indication that morning had arrived. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the others, felt his way to the cave entrance by memory and familiarity, stepped outside into pre-dawn darkness that was somehow less absolute than the cave's interior. The sky held the barest suggestion of gray on the eastern horizon. Dawn was still 30 minutes away, right on schedule. Just like every morning of his adult life, this wasn't learned behavior though. Experience had reinforced it. This was biological programming, an internal clock that had been ticking since birth, synchronized to the rotation of the Earth, adjusted for the extreme seasonal variations of Ice Age Europe. A clock that functioned independently of external cues, that could track time even in the perpetual darkness of a deep cave. Your body has the same clock. You call it your circadian rhythm, from the Latin words meaning around a day. It's controlled by a cluster of cells in your brain's hypothalamus, about 20,000 neurons that fire in coordinated patterns across a 24-hour cycle. These neurons regulate your sleep-wake patterns, your body temperature, your hormone release, your alertness levels, your metabolism. Nearly every system in your body runs on circadian time, but not everyone's clock runs the same way. Some people wake naturally at dawn, alert and energized. Others struggle to open their eyes before 9. Some people hit their cognitive peak in early morning. Others don't feel fully functional until afternoon. The difference isn't just habit or discipline. It's genetic. And some of those genes came from Neanderthals. Multiple circadian clock genes show Neanderthal variants in modern populations. Clock, per1, per2, per3. Each of these genes plays a role in maintaining your body's internal rhythm. The Neanderthal versions create subtle differences in how the system operates. Research published in 2021 examined how these variants adapted to the extreme light conditions of Ice Age Europe. At northern latitudes, summer days stretched to 18 hours or more. Winter days shrank to 6 hours of weak sunlight. This extreme seasonal variation created intense selective pressure on circadian systems. The individuals whose internal clocks could adapt to massive light changes survived better. Those whose systems couldn't adjust struggled with sleep disruption, seasonal energy crashes, depression during the long darkness. The per3 gene variant from Neanderthals is particularly interesting. Modern carriers of this variant wake up an average of 1 hour earlier than people without it, and report feeling more alert in the morning. They're the people who bound out of bed at 6, who schedule important meetings before 9, who can't understand why anyone would want to sleep past dawn. If you're one of these people, thank your Neanderthal ancestors, or curse them, depending on how you feel about mornings. Crag watched the sky gradually brighten, gray becoming pale blue, becoming the soft gold of sunrise. His body temperature had been rising for the past hour, preparing him for activity. His cortisol levels had peaked right at waking, giving him natural energy. His metabolism had shifted from nighttime maintenance mode to daytime active mode, all of it orchestrated by his circadian clock. all of it happening without conscious thought. Behind him in the cave, Nira stirred. She always woke second, her own internal clock set about 30 minutes behind his. Not late by any measure, but later than Crag. Their biological rhythms were synchronized enough to coordinate their daily routines, but different enough to show individual variation. Even within Neanderthal populations, even with shared genes, the clock ran slightly differently in each person. Other circadian effects were more dramatic. Seasonal affective disorder, that depression that descends with winter darkness, shows connections to Neanderthal gene variants. The same genetic adaptations that helped Ice Age humans function through long, dark winters sometimes malfunction in modern humans. Creating mood disorders tied to day length and light exposure, the genes also affect melatonin production. That hormone your brain releases to make you sleepy. Vitamin D sensitivity, serotonin levels, dopamine processing. The entire complex network of neurochemicals that regulate mood, all of them influenced by circadian timing. All of them potentially carrying Neanderthal variants by the time the sun cleared the horizon. Crag had already surveyed the valley, checked the weather signs, and begun planning the day's hunt. His early rising gave him an advantage. Time to think, to prepare, to move before prey animals had fully settled into their daytime routines. In a world where every advantage mattered, where the difference between success and failure could mean clan survival. Waking early was power. The other hunters began emerging from the cave. Some moved easily, their own internal clocks aligned with the dawn. Others looked sluggish, needing time to fully wake. Crag had learned over the years who to take on morning hunts and who functioned better in afternoon. You worked with people's natural rhythms, not against them. His eldest daughter appeared beside him, alert and ready despite the early hour. She'd inherited his clock, his morning peak, his natural synchronization with sunrise. In 10 years, she'd be leading her own hunting parties at dawn. Using the same genetic advantage her father possessed, but the clock ticking in Crag's. Cells did more than wake him for the hunt. It governed something far more fundamental, something that determined whether his lineage would survive at all. It controlled whether Nira, now 9 months pregnant with their second daughter, would deliver a child capable of surviving its first winter. The contractions had started at dawn. Nira had woken with the first one, a tightening across her belly that made her catch her breath. She'd said nothing, just risen and begun her morning tasks. Knowing that labor could take many hours and there was no point alarming anyone yet. By midday, contractions were coming regularly. Every few minutes, that tightening sensation becoming pressure, becoming pain. She'd retreated to the back of the cave, where the older women waited. 3 of them, grandmothers and experienced mothers who'd attended dozens of births. They knew what to do. They'd seen it go right, and they'd seen it go terribly wrong. Crag paced outside. Birth was women's territory. Men weren't allowed inside during labor, weren't wanted there. He felt useless and anxious. He'd already lost one mate to childbirth years ago. Before Nira had watched her bleed to death after delivering a son who didn't survive his first day. The memory made his chest tight. Inside the cave, Nira labored. The pain was immense now, coming in waves that obliterated thought. Her body was trying to push a human being out through an opening that seemed impossibly small. She could feel the baby's head pressing down, could feel her pelvis straining to accommodate the passage. The older women supported her, one on each side, helping her squat in a position that gravity could assist. Birth is dangerous. Always has been. Before modern medicine, childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. The numbers are staggering. In pre-industrial societies, maternal mortality rates ranged from 1% to 2% per birth. That might not sound high until you realize that most women had 5 to 8 children. Do the math. A woman's lifetime risk of dying in childbirth was 10 to 20%. For Neanderthals, the risk was even higher. Their babies had larger heads than Homo sapiens infants, bigger brains, bigger skulls, more difficult passage through the birth canal. Neanderthal women had wider pelvises than modern humans. an adaptation to accommodate those larger babies. But it still wasn't enough. Birth was a life-threatening event every single time. Natural selection shaped reproductive genes intensely. The genes that helped women carry pregnancies successfully, that helped them survive labor, that helped babies survive the birth process those genes spread. The variants that didn't were eliminated ruthlessly. Some of those successful genes came from Neanderthals, and they're still affecting modern pregnancies today. The PGR gene, which codes for the progesterone receptor, shows Neanderthal variants in modern populations. Progesterone is crucial for pregnancy. It maintains the uterine lining, prevents premature contractions, supports fetal development. Research published in 2023 found that certain Neanderthal variants of the progesterone receptor gene reduce miscarriage risk by about 10%. 10% might not sound like much, but in a population constantly on the edge of survival, where every successful birth mattered, where population size determined whether your group would persist or vanish, 10% made an enormous difference. The trade-off is that some of these same variants slightly increase gestational diabetes risk. Again, the double-edged sword of ancient adaptations in modern contexts. The genes that helped Neanderthal women maintain pregnancies in harsh conditions sometimes cause problems in modern pregnancies. With different nutritional environments, other Neanderthal genes affect the placenta, that remarkable organ that connects mother and baby, exchanging nutrients and oxygen while filtering out most harmful substances. Genes controlling placental development, blood flow, nutrient transfer, multiple variants with Neanderthal origins that change how efficiently the placenta functions. Nira was 14, hours into labor now, exhausted, her body running on reserve she didn't know she had. The baby was coming, finally coming, the head crowning, stretching tissue to the tearing point. The old women encouraged her, told her to push, to work with the contractions. One more push, one more. Then the baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid. Girl. Smaller than Nira's first daughter had been, which made sense. Female babies tend to be smaller than males. The reduced size made the birth slightly easier, though easier is a relative term. When you're talking about pushing a baby through your pelvis without anesthesia, the baby cried immediately. A healthy sound, lungs inflating for the first time. One of the old women cleaned the infant's mouth and nose, cleared the airway. Another cut the umbilical cord with a sharp flint blade and tied it off. They wrapped the baby in soft leather and placed her on Nira's chest, skin-to-skin contact. The baby's body temperature dropped rapidly after leaving the womb's warmth, but pressed against her mother's body, she could maintain warmth. Could smell her mother, feel her heartbeat, begin to root for the breast and the milk that would be her first food. This is where Neanderthal genes show another effect. Thermoregulation in newborns. Research has found that some modern babies with higher percentages of Neanderthal DNA show slightly better cold tolerance in their first weeks of life. Variants affecting brown fat distribution that specialized tissue babies use to generate heat. Variants affecting metabolic rate and heat production. In Ice Age Europe, where caves were cold and exposure could kill a newborn in ours, these variants were life-saving. Modern babies carrying them are slightly more resilient to temperature fluctuations, slightly better at maintaining body temperature without distress. Cragg was allowed in once the immediate danger had passed. He knelt beside Nira, looking down at his new daughter. She was perfect. Tiny, but healthy, nursing already, her small fists clenched against her mother's skin. Nira looked exhausted, but alive. They'd both survived. Another generation secured. They named her Lyra, small Lyra. Born in the depths of winter, carried through birth by genes 400,000 years old. Genes that would shape not just her body, but her mind. How she learned, how she thought, whether her brain would wire itself like her father's, or develop in entirely new directions. The mixing of Neanderthal and Homo sapiens DNA was creating new kinds of brains. And Lyra represented the future of that experiment. Lyra was 6 months old when Crag first noticed something different about her, the way she watched things. The intensity of her focus when something caught her attention. She could stare at a piece of hanging sinew swaying in the cave entrance for minutes at a time, completely absorbed, studying the pattern of its movement with an attention that seemed unusual for an infant. His older daughter had been different. More social from the start, always watching faces, responding to voices, engaging with people. But Lyra watched objects, patterns, the way firelight flickered on cave walls, the way water dripped from stone. She seemed more interested in understanding how things worked than in interacting with the people around her. Crag didn't think this was bad, just different. He recognized something of himself in her intense focus, her preference for observing over socializing. Some children were like this. Some weren't. Both types survived. Both contributed to the clan in different ways. By the time Lyra was 3 years old, the difference had become more pronounced. Her older sister, now 17, had learned tool making by watching the group, absorbing technique through social learning, asking questions, working collaboratively. Lyra learned differently. She would take a piece of flint and work it alone for hours, experimenting with different striking angles, discovering techniques through systematic trial and error rather than observation and imitation. Today, Crag sat with his older daughter, teaching her a complex technique for creating long, thin blades from prepared cores. The method required precise strikes at exact angles, and one mistake could ruin hours of preparation work. His daughter watched his hands carefully, asked questions, practiced under his guidance. Lyra sat nearby, 3 years old, working with her own pieces of stone. Too young for real tool making, but she'd found some soft limestone that flaked easily. She wasn't watching Crag's demonstration. She was absorbed in her own experimentation, striking her stones together, examining the results, adjusting her approach based on what she observed. The sound filled the cave entrance. Stone on stone, a rhythmic percussion. Crag's careful, controlled strikes. His daughter's similar rhythm as she mimicked him. And Lyra's irregular pattern: strike, pause, examine, strike from different angle, examine again. 3 different learning styles. 3 different approaches to the same fundamental skill. Your brain is the most complex object in the known universe. 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others, creating a network of trillions of synapses. The way those neurons connect, the timing of neural development, the balance of neurotransmitters, all of it, shapes how you think, how you learn, how you experience consciousness itself. And Neanderthal genes affect that. Architecture multiple brain-related genes show Neanderthal variants in modern populations. CATS2 affects neural development and synaptic connections. CNTNAP2 influences language development and social cognition. These variants change the timing of brain development, alter how neurons wire together, shift the balance between different cognitive systems. Research published in 2020 found fascinating correlations. People carrying certain Neanderthal brain gene variants show slightly increased rates of autism spectrum traits, enhanced systemizing, stronger pattern recognition, more detail-focused attention, better visual memory, but also more challenges with face recognition, social cue interpretation, flexible thinking. This isn't saying Neanderthals were autistic. That would be an oversimplification. But it suggests that Neanderthal brains may have been wired differently than Homo sapiens brains. Not better or worse, different. With different cognitive strengths and weaknesses, Neanderthal. Skulls were shaped differently than modern human skulls. Longer from front to back. Larger occipital lobes, the brain region that processes visual information. Slightly smaller temporal lobes, regions involved in social cognition and language. These structural differences suggest functional differences. Different ways of processing information, understanding the world, solving problems. Modern neuroimaging studies have found that people with higher percentages of Neanderthal DNA sometimes show subtle differences in brain structure. The differences are small, but measurable. Slight variations in the shape of certain brain regions, different patterns of neural connectivity, altered balance between brain systems. The DRD4 gene tells another part of this story. This gene codes for a dopamine receptor, affecting how your brain responds to novelty and reward. Neanderthal variants of DRD4 are associated with novelty-seeking behavior, risk-taking, and ADHD traits. The restless mind that can't settle, that needs constant stimulation, jumps from interest to interest, that might be a Neanderthal gift. In Ice Age Europe, novelty-seeking had survival value. The willingness to explore new territories, try new hunting techniques, experiment with new tools. But that same trait can be disruptive in modern classrooms designed for sustained attention on single tasks. Cragg watched Lyra work, noting her fierce concentration, her systematic approach, her apparent indifference to the social learning happening beside her. She was figuring out the principles of flaking stone through pure experimentation. Slower than social learning, perhaps, but more thorough. She was building understanding from the ground up. His older daughter learned faster through demonstration and imitation, but she was more dependent on having someone to teach her. Lyra could teach herself, given time and materials. Different strength, different weaknesses. Both valuable. Not all clan children learned the way Lyra did. Most were more like her sister, learning through social observation and instruction. But every clan had a few children like Lyra, the intense ones, the ones who seemed to live partly in their own worlds, who thought differently, who saw patterns others missed. Some of those children became the best toolmakers, the most innovative problem solvers, the ones who figured out new techniques that spread through the population. Their different thinking style was a resource, not a deficit. Cragg's teaching style matched his own cognitive traits, precise, systematic, focused on exact technique rather than social encouragement. His older daughter adapted well to this approach because she could read his intention beneath his sparse words. But he'd noticed that other fathers taught differently. More talking, more social interaction, more flexibility in approach. Neither way was wrong. Cognitive diversity meant different people excelled at different tasks. The clan needed systematic thinkers like Cragg and Lyra, but it also needed socially brilliant people who could negotiate with other clans, maintain group harmony, teach through encouragement and relationship. What Cragg couldn't know was that his genes weren't just creating different kinds of minds. They were doing something more controversial, something geneticists are only beginning to understand. They were affecting mental health itself. The same DNA that helped Neanderthals survive ice, age isolation was making some modern humans more vulnerable to the darkness inside their own heads. The darkness came with winter. Not just the literal darkness of short days and long nights, but something else. Something internal. Cragg felt it settling over him like a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, dulling his thoughts, making every action require more effort than it should. He still functioned. Still hunted when the weather allowed. Still maintained his tools, contributed to clan survival, fulfilled his responsibilities as a provider and protector, but the joy had leached out of everything. The satisfaction he normally felt from a successful hunt, from his daughter's development, from Nira's companionship, all of it felt muted and distant. Like experiencing life through a thick fog, the clan had retreated deep into the cave system for the worst of the winter. Snow blocked the outer entrances. They lived by firelight in the interior chambers, burning through their carefully hoarded fuel, rationing food, waiting for the storms to pass. Days blurred together in monotonous sameness. Wake in darkness, eat, tend the fire, sleep, wake again to more darkness. Cragg knew this feeling. It came most winters, though some years were worse than others. It would pass when the light returned, when the days lengthened and the hunting improved and life regained its rhythm. But knowing it would pass didn't make the present moment easier to bear. He sat by the fire, working a piece of hide soft enough for baby clothing, his hands moving automatically while his mind wandered through dark territory. He thought about the clan member they'd lost to fever last autumn, about the harsh winter and whether their food stores would last, about his own aging body, The way his joints ached more each year? The way injuries took longer to heal? About death, about the inevitable end that awaited every living thing, Neera watched him with concern. She recognized the signs, the withdrawal, the silence that went beyond his normally quiet nature. She'd learned over the years not to push him during these dark periods. He wasn't dangerous, wasn't incapacitated, just diminished somehow. Less present. She maintained the household routines, cared for the children, and waited for the light to return her mate to himself. What neither of them could know was that Craig's winter melancholy was partly genetic, written into his neurotransmitter systems, into the genes that controlled how his brain produced and processed serotonin, dopamine, and other mood-regulating chemicals. Depression is ancient. The fossil record can't tell us if Neanderthals experienced it. But the genetic record suggests they carried many of the same risk variants that make modern humans vulnerable to mood disorders. And some of those risk variants have been passed down to you. Multiple Neanderthal gene variants affect neurotransmitter systems. Serotonin transporters that regulate mood and anxiety. Dopamine receptors that influence motivation and pleasure. Stress hormone pathways that determine how intensely your body responds to threats. All of these systems show Neanderthal genetic, an influence in modern populations. Research published in 2019 found that certain Neanderthal variants are associated with increased depression risk in modern humans. The effect size is modest. These variants don't guarantee depression any more than Craig's genes guaranteed his winter melancholy. But they shift the odds. They make the brain more vulnerable to environmental stressors, less resilient in the face of darkness and isolation. Other Neanderthal variants affect addiction susceptibility. The CHRNA3 gene, which influences nicotine receptors, shows Neanderthal variants that increase smoking addiction risk in modern populations. Genes affecting alcohol metabolism, impulse control, reward-seeking behavior, multiple pathways where Neanderthal DNA influences modern mental health. The evolutionary logic is complex. In Ice Age Europe, certain psychological traits that we'd now classify as mood disorders might have been adaptive. Hypervigilance in the face of constant danger, a hair-trigger stress response that helped you react to predators, the ability to endure long periods of isolation and monotony without breaking down, a dampened mood that conserved energy during winter scarcity. These traits had survival value in that environment. But transplant them into modern life, and they become liabilities. The hypervigilance becomes anxiety disorder. The hair-trigger stress response becomes panic attacks. The ability to endure isolation becomes depression. The genes that helped Neanderthals survive Ice Age, as conditions sometimes harm their descendants in modern contexts. Neera experienced her own version of this struggle. Not depression like Craig's, but anxiety that sometimes overwhelmed her capacity to cope, worry that spiraled into panic, fear that something terrible was about to happen, even when everything was objectively fine. She managed it better in summer, when there was enough light and food and work to keep her mind occupied. Winter made it worse. Her anxiety had a genetic component too. Variants affecting stress hormone regulation. Neural pathways involved in fear response. Genes that made her amygdala, the brain's fear center, more reactive than average. In moderation, this made her cautious, careful, attentive to danger signals. Pushed too far, it became debilitating, but both of them were good parents. Both contributed to clan survival. Both passed their genes, with all their complications, forward to the next generation. Lyra and her older sister would inherit some of these variants, would face their own struggles with mood and stress in the chemical architecture of their minds. It's crucial to understand that genes are not destiny. The Neanderthal variants that increase mental health risks don't determine outcomes. Environment matters enormously. Social support, life circumstances. Individual experience all of these factors. Interact with genetic predisposition in complex ways. Some people carry higher risk variants and never develop mood disorders. Others carry low risk variants and still struggle with depression or anxiety. The genes load the dice but don't dictate the role. And there's another side to this story. Some Neanderthal mood-regulating variants appear to be protective rather than risky. Certain serotonin transporter genes associated with resilience, the ability to bounce back from stress, with emotional stability. The genetic inheritance was mixed, as genetic inheritances always are. As winter deepened, Crag endured. His daughters brought him out of himself sometimes, particularly Lyra, with her constant questions and her unique way of seeing the world. Neera's presence helped too, though he couldn't have articulated how or why. The human capacity for connection. For finding meaning in relationship even during the darkest times, that was its own kind of genetic inheritance. By late winter, as the days began to imperceptibly lengthen, Crag felt the darkness lifting, slowly at first, then more noticeably. His appetite returned. His interest in the world rekindled. The fog cleared and he could feel joy again, simple pleasure in his daughter's laughter and Neera's touch. In the first signs of approaching spring, the cycle would repeat next winter. He knew that. But he also knew he'd survive it again, just as he had every winter of his adult life. His genes gave him vulnerabilities, but they also gave him the capacity to endure. What Crag couldn't know was that the darkness he experienced was nothing compared to what was coming. Not to him personally, but to his people. A threat his Neanderthal genes had no answer for. Because 40,000 years ago, something changed. Something that would determine whether you'd be reading these words or whether humanity would be a purely Neanderthal species today. 10 years had passed since Lyra's birth. Crag was 45 now, ancient by Neanderthal standards. Most males didn't live past 40. His body carried the accumulated damage of decades of brutal existence, a limp from the old mammoth injury. Fingers that didn't straighten completely after too many breaks, joints that ached in cold weather, teeth worn down to nubbins. But he was still strong, still capable. Still the clan's primary hunter, though his older daughter's mate had begun taking on more of that responsibility. The clan had shrunk over the decade. Disease and hunting accidents and difficult births had taken their toll. They numbered 15 now, down from 23 when Crag had been in his prime, and the valley was filling with strangers. The Homo sapiens population had grown steadily. Crag could see their fires every night now, scattered across the landscape like a constellation of earthbound stars. Where his people had once 3 small camps, the newcomers had 7, maybe 8. Their numbers seemed to swell with each passing season, while Neanderthal numbers dwindled. It wasn't violence. The two populations mostly avoided each other. Though there were occasional meetings, occasional trading of tools or information about game movements, some Neanderthal women had gone to live with Homo sapiens groups. Some children were clearly of mixed heritage, showing features of both populations. Crag stood on the ridge above his cave, watching smoke rise from the valley below. His daughters were teenagers now. His older daughter had mated with a Neanderthal male, but suitable mates were becoming scarce. There were fewer pure Neanderthal clans each year. The nearest one was 2 days' travel away, and they faced the same declining numbers. Lyra, now 10, stood beside him. She'd grown into her unusual mind, becoming the clan's most innovative toolmaker, despite her youth. She'd recently figured out a new method for hafting points to spears that held more securely than the traditional technique. Her different way of thinking had become an asset. But even Lyra's innovations couldn't solve the fundamental problem. They were being outnumbered. Crag didn't understand why. The Homo sapiens didn't seem superior in any obvious way. They weren't better hunters individually. Their tools weren't dramatically better. They didn't seem smarter or stronger or more adapted to the environment. But they had more children. Their populations grew faster. Their groups were larger and more stable. Modern science can offer explanations that Crag couldn't access. Climate change was shifting Ice Age Europe toward warmer conditions. Conditions that favored the more gracile, African-adapted Homo sapiens physiology. Neanderthal stocky builds and high-calorie requirements were optimized for cold. The cold was retreating. Population genetics offers another explanation. Neanderthals had always existed in small, scattered groups. Limited genetic diversity. Vulnerability to inbreeding depression. When populations are small, Random chance plays an oversized role. A harsh winter, a disease outbreak, a string of hunting accident. Any of these could devastate a clan beyond recovery. Homo sapiens arrived in larger groups with more genetic diversity. They could absorb losses that would destroy Neanderthal clans. They could maintain larger social networks, share resources across wider territories, bounce back from disasters that were extinction events for smaller populations. There's also the question of culture. Homo sapiens showed more elaborate symbolic behavior, more complex social structures, more innovative cultural practices. Whether this represented cognitive differences or just cultural evolution is debated, but the result was clear. They were outcompeting Neanderthals not through violence but through sheer demographic advantage. Cragg made a decision that day on the ridge, a decision born of pragmatism rather than defeat. When Homo sapiens hunters approached his camp 3 days later on a peaceful trading mission, he didn't drive them away. He invited them to share the fire, to talk about game movements and tool techniques, to meet his daughters. One of the young Homo sapiens males was clearly interested in Lyra, tall and lean where Neanderthal males were stocky, with a flatter face and prominent chin. He watched Lyra work on her tools with obvious fascination. She, characteristically, seemed more interested in examining his spear points than in the young male himself. But Cragg saw the possibility. Lyra's children might be hybrids, might carry some of her unusual brilliance into a Homo sapiens population that could provide the numbers and stability her pure Neanderthal clan couldn't offer. It wasn't the future Cragg had imagined for his lineage, but it was a future. And that was more than many Neanderthal families had. The last pure Neanderthals probably survived until about 37,000 years ago in refugia in southern Europe and Gibraltar. Small, isolated populations clinging to existence as the world changed around them. But their genes didn't vanish. The interbreeding that had begun 50,000 years earlier continued until the end. Neanderthals didn't go extinct in the way the dinosaurs did. They were absorbed, merged into the growing Homo sapiens population. Their genes diluted but preserved, spreading through human populations at low but persistent frequencies. From a genetic perspective, it was a successful strategy. If the measure of evolutionary success is spreading your genes into future generations, Neanderthals succeeded spectacularly. 2 billion modern humans carry their DNA. Their immune genes fight modern diseases. Their metabolic genes process modern food. Their brain genes shape modern minds. Cragg couldn't know that his great-great-granddaughter would carry his DNA into a Homo sapiens clan. Couldn't know that 40,000 years later, his genes would be protecting humans fighting off flu in modern cities, standing at high altitude, surviving surgery, thinking in unique patterns. He only knew that survival meant adaptation. And the ultimate adaptation was becoming part of something larger. As the Homo sapiens hunters left his camp, promising to return, Cragg felt something he hadn't expected. Not defeat, not resignation. Something closer to hope. The world was changing. His people were changing with it, even if that meant becoming something new, something hybrid, something that carried forward the best of what Neanderthals had been while embracing an uncertain future. That night, he watched Lyra by the fire, her intense focus bent on a new tool design, her Neanderthal mind working through problems her own way. Whatever happened, whatever the future held, that brilliance would survive. Those genes would persist. The savage gifts that Ice Age Europe had forged would live on. Cragg's fire burned through the night while his clan slept. He tended it in the darkness, adding fuel, watching sparks rise toward the cave ceiling. He didn't know his species would vanish. Didn't know that in a few thousand years, pure Neanderthals would no longer exist. But 40,000 years later, a different human looks at a genetic test result on a glowing screen. 2.3% Neanderthal DNA, not a metaphor, not an approximation. Actual genes from actual people who survived actual Ice Age winters. Your immune system is using those genes right now, fighting viruses with Neanderthal proteins. Your blood carries Neanderthal clotting factors. Your skin reflects Neanderthal pigmentation genes. Your brain wires itself with patterns influenced by Neanderthal neural development genes. You are part Neanderthal. Your body is a battlefield where ancient genes meet modern challenges. Craig's legacy lives in billions, fighting to keep you alive, adapting to a world he couldn't imagine. Success isn't pure survival. It's genetic survival. And by that measure, the Neanderthals won.